One sec. Today we're going to be talking about the moon. And the moon is the second part of this astrological trilogy in the major arcana, the star, the moon, and the sun. And so it's the middle part. And I thought I'd start today by explaining the kind of the practical fortune-telling-y side of the moon, which is that it's the middle point in a process. So what these three cards together can tell you in a sense that is applicable to any kind of a divination in your life is that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. The star is the beginning, and it's that moment of preparing, starting the journey, starting the process, and there's a certain enthusiasm. And then the moon is the middle part, where that initial enthusiasm is gone and you're just going down that highway, right? If you look at the images of the moon, this is the image from the card that we're using here, but I'm going to show you one from the Thoth deck, which is more appropriate here, that you see it is a path, right, that goes through a mountain path, right? And it gives this whole idea of you're on the highway driving and driving and driving, and the kids are in the back going, are we there yet? Are we there yet? That's the moon. And the sun is when you arrive. So if you click this video just to find out what the moon means when you get it in a tarot reading, it means that you're in this middle spot, and that what you have to do is hang tough, because if you quit now, then everything you've started is pointless. And if you keep going and you push through that sense of are we there yet, then you're going to get there. Just trust the process. Okay, so with that out of the way, the moon's a very interesting card. It has a parallel of images with a number of other cards in the tarot. You can see in the deck that I'm using here, it's done in a very stylized fashion, but you have a central path with twin columns. In very traditional decks, it often looks like two towers, basically, and even in the Thoth deck, the columns are made to look like great Egyptian towers, right? And that can make sense because towers are landmarks, and these are meant to mark the borders of the narrow path, right? There's a parallel there between the columns in this card and the card of the High Priestess. There you were crossing through the columns to enter the temple. Here you're crossing through these profound underworld columns to reach awakening. You're moving towards the light. In the High Priestess, you were moving towards the veil. There's also an element of parallel with the Fool card, because what you're doing in the moon is you're moving along. I'm going to keep using the Thoth deck in this case because the imagery is a lot clearer in this one. Here you have the little dung beetle. It's often represented by a lobster in other tarot decks, but Crowley used the dung beetle because the dung beetle is the god Kethra, who's the god of the sun at midnight, at the darkest point, in the lowest point of the world. That is when the sun's in the underworld, and he's pushing it along this path, right? This path that leads to the horizon. But it doesn't stop at the horizon. At the horizon, there's this cliff. You have to conceive that when you get to there's a cliff, just like there was in the Fool card. And just like in the Fool card, you want to jump off that cliff. Here, what you have is the moon above. It's dropping dewdrops. That might be difficult to see that far away. Here we go. The moon is dropping these dewdrops down on the world, which are meant to be the pure creative force, the Holy Spirit. In Crowley's version, the dewdrops look like little yods, which is the Hebrew letter that is the first letter of the Tetragrammaton, the name of God, and it represents pure creative power, right? And this Holy Spirit is grace. So it's something that if you get to that cliff, you take a step forward where you would fall, but this grace lifts you up and it takes you up past the moon and towards the sun. But there's nothing you can do to make that happen, right? It's a kind of, it's a Jacob's ladder, but you can't climb it. You have to trust that this escalator of divinity is going to lead you up. So it's just like the fool, it's a question of giving up your sense of control and taking the jump. And in a way, when you get to the moon, after all this time, all this work and effort and the spiritual process that you've been going through, you suddenly realize that you're still just the fool and you're still just falling off that cliff. But this is the moment of grace. This is a very ancient set of imagery. It's even visible in the earliest forms of mystical tradition. In Mircea Eliade's book on shamanism, he does a very good description of this basic process, this shamanic process that existed in almost all primitive cultures, that you can boil down shamanism to this basic concept of this initiation that happens for the shaman that begins with a cleansing, a purification, and then he descends into the underworld. He has to be cut to pieces. He's chopped into bits, or he's mauled, or he's devoured, and then he's in the underworld, the lower world, and there he passes through the underworld where he's completely destroyed and then recreated with a completely new body. It's an alchemy that happens. And then he's raised up to the upper world, where there he discovers these keys of how to be the shaman for the tribe, and then brought back down into the middle world. And that's the process of shamanic transformation, which is another way of describing the process of enlightenment, where first you have to be initiated and do this purification work so that you can get to this moment of self-annihilation, of the annihilation of the ego, where everything vanishes. And then there's this moment of enlightenment, which you then use to return into this world and to be completely ordinary, but transformed from this journey. The moon is the middle step. It's when you're in that state of having surrendered and waiting for that grace. So it's sometimes called the dark night of the soul. It's the abyss. It's the darkest of the dark moments, the darkest moment right before the dawn. In the Buddha story, it's all night long that the Buddha struggles under the banyan tree after many, many years of trying to obtain this enlightenment. He sits himself down and he basically determines that he's either going to do it or he's going to die in this night, right? And he sits and he meditates like crazy and he struggles very, very, very hard for hours and hours all through the night, and nothing is happening. And then there's this moment just before the dawn where he surrenders completely. He gives up. He says, I can't do it. I'm not enough to do it, right? And at that moment that he lets go of absolutely everything, there is this moment of transformation that happens. But just before that complete awakening, there is this story in the Buddha account that Mara, the god of, or demon of illusion, comes before the Buddha with all of his children, all of his demonic children, to try to tempt the Buddha, to try to scare the Buddha, to try to seduce the Buddha, to try to do anything possible so that the Buddha will hold on to some little piece of desire, of himself, of attachment. And of course the Buddha doesn't. And so Mara is dispersed, and then the awakening occurs. The moon card represents that moment of dispersion, of having given everything up, and then all around you there is this there's this temptation, this illusion. You are walking through the middle path, the path between the two columns, surrounded by illusion all around you, but determined to carry the sun past that horizon. So you can see that there's this very narrow little path, and everything around is watery, shallow, it's ephemeral. There's all of these distractions and illusions all around, and you're trying to go down that middle path. The name in Western esotericism for this king of illusion is Choronzon, the demon of dispersion. And this is something that appears many times. It's this temptation, this idea of distraction, of wanting to cling to one little thing that keeps you from succeeding in the transformation. The Greek story of Orpheus, the myth of Orpheus, is a myth of awakening. It's got an element of that shamanic journey we talked about earlier, and it's got an element of the later development in the mystery schools of this process of Gnostic enlightenment. And so in the story, Orpheus goes to try to retrieve his wife to the underworld. He goes through all of these challenges, these trials, to obtain a way to get to the underworld. He learns all these secret keys. He learns how to trick Cerberus, the dog that guards the underworld. He learns all of these secrets of how to survive, to get to the underworld, to rescue his wife who had died because he was to bring her back, right? And he manages to get her. He manages to even convince Hades to release her, to overcome death. But the one condition is that he can't look at her until he gets right back to the surface, until he comes out from the underworld. And he walks up the steps leading away from the underworld and back to our world. But at one moment there, uncertain if she's really there behind him, he turns and looks, and she disappears forever, and he knows that he's lost her forever. And so this is an illusion, an allusion, a metaphor about this process of awakening, that if you look back, if you have this moment where you try to hold on just to one thing, just to one doubt, just to one idea, to one notion, to one desire, then you're going to miss that transformation. You have to stay on that straight and narrow path of the moon. A similar imagery appears in a way in the story of Lot's wife, in the destruction of Sodom in the Bible. God tells Lot that he alone can be spared. He can receive this grace. And he is to abandon Sodom, but he cannot look back. And so he and his family leave, but his wife turns back, and she gets turned into a pillar of salt in that moment. She's no longer worthy of her humanity. And this is the essence, is this choice between, are you going to be fully human, or are you going to be this creature that clings to this world? There's a great element of these chthonic creatures, this primordialness, the dogs, the lobsters, the dung beetle. All of these things, in one sense, can be seen as these barriers, the guardians that prevent you from moving forward, the challenges. But what they are is really a part of yourself. We've already said all challenges are a part of you. And this is the nature of the animal part, the most primal part of the ego, trying to grab onto something, to bite anything it can so that it doesn't have to die. We're going to continue this in part 2.